Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was supposed to be just another fun, laid-back sleepover, the kind we'd had countless times before. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. A night with my friends, Tyler, Jordan, and Mia, hanging out, watching horror movies, eating junk food, and laughing at the stupidest jokes. It was going to be another one of those perfect nights, like all the others. Tyler's house was always the chosen spot. A typical suburban home in California, the kind you'd see on every street, blending into the scenery. It wasn't a mansion, but it had a certain charm. The rooms were small and simple, the kitchen was modest, and the living room was where we always gathered. It had a large, cushy couch where we spent hours sinking into its soft cushions, binge watching movies, and talking about everything and nothing. Even though the house wasn't new and had a few signs of age, it still felt cozy. The carpet in the hallway had seen better days, its beige color fading from years of use, and the wallpaper in the living room was peeling at the edges, looking worn and tired. There was always a faint, slightly musty scent in the air, the kind of smell that clings to old houses. A sort of comforting smell, though, one that made it feel lived in and familiar. You could tell the house had been around for a while, but it still felt like home. That night, we set up camp in Tyler's bedroom. The bed was unmade as usual, with a pile of clothes and old video game cases scattered across the floor. Posters of his favorite bands and action movies covered the walls, the corners of some curling slightly from years of being taped up. The room was cluttered, but it didn't matter to us. We didn't need it to be perfect. We were happy to be together, enjoying the kind of simple fun that only the best sleepovers could bring. We laughed at dumb inside jokes, quoted our favorite movie scenes, and stuffed our faces with pizza and soda. It was the perfect night until around 3 a.m. when everything changed. We were all lounging lazily, too full and too tired to do much more. The cool night air was creeping in through the cracks in the windows, and the only sound in the house was the distant hum of cars passing by on the street. One by one, the exhaustion of the night took over, and we started to doze off. Jordan and Mia fell asleep first, lying on the floor beside the bed with their feet tangled in blankets. Tyler was sprawled across the bed with me, his breathing deep and steady, already out cold. It was just one of those nights, the kind where everything feels familiar and safe until it's not. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up, but I knew something was wrong. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't like a loud noise or a sudden shock, but more like a feeling. Something heavy and uncomfortable settled on my chest. My heart was pounding, racing faster than it should have been for no reason. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was just having a weird dream. I turned over, curling up in the blanket again, hoping to fall back into a peaceful sleep. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Soft, almost muffled, but unmistakable. Someone walking around in the living room. It was strange, though. The house was supposed to be empty, right? I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just my imagination, playing tricks on me. But the sound persisted. It was faint at first, like someone walking slowly across the room, as if they were trying not to be heard. I froze, my body tensing involuntarily. I held my breath, straining my ears, but then nothing. The sound stopped, and the house was eerily silent again. I waited, my heart still racing, but it didn't happen again. Maybe it was nothing. I told myself that over and over, trying to calm down. It was just a strange noise. It could be the house settling, the wind outside moving things around. My mind was making a mountain out of a molehill. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to drift back to sleep, but it wasn't that easy. After a few minutes, I couldn't ignore it anymore. A dry mouth, a gnawing thirst, it was enough to get me up. I had to get some water. There was no way I'd fall asleep with that feeling still lingering in the back of my mind. I tried to move as quietly as possible, careful not to wake Jordan and Mia, who were both curled up on the floor beside me. I slid out of bed, the cold air brushing against my skin as I stood up. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound far too loud in the stillness of the night. The hallway outside Tyler's room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a street lamp outside the living room window. The light filtered through the blinds, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls, which seemed to stretch and distort in the silence. The air felt colder too, like the house had gotten a few degrees chillier while I was asleep. There was a musty smell in the air, as if the house had been closed up for a while. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing louder than I expected. I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine, but I brushed it off. It was just a stupid feeling. Nothing was wrong. When I reached the living room, though, I froze in my tracks. There, sitting on the couch, was a man. At first, my mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was Tyler's older brother or one of their friends who had come over, waking up early for some reason. But as I looked more closely, confusion turned into dread. I didn't recognize this man. He was just sitting there, staring blankly at the TV, his back to me. His posture was stiff, his hands folded neatly in his lap, as if he were waiting. But waiting for what? My heart stopped. My legs turned to jelly. The man wasn't anyone I knew, and he looked out of place like he didn't belong here. His clothes were dirty, his jacket worn and torn in places, as if he'd been outside for hours. His face was partially hidden by shadows, but I could make out the unshaven chin and the hollow cheeks, the pale, sickly look of someone who hadn't slept in days. What sent a chill through me, though, was his breathing. It was uneven, almost desperate, like he'd been running, his chest rising and falling in sharp, erratic gasps. He was tense, on edge, like he was waiting for someone, or something. I felt my breath catch in my throat. What the hell was going on? How did he get in? Why was he here? I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I backed away slowly, each step feeling like it was dragging me deeper into the nightmare I was trying to avoid. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I was sure he could hear it. I didn't dare look away from him, but I couldn't stay there either. I turned and fled down the hall, my legs shaking beneath me. I slammed the door to Tyler's room behind me, waking him up instantly. "Tyler!" I whispered urgently, my voice trembling. "Tyler, wake up! There's someone in the house!" He blinked, confused, his eyes still bleary from sleep. "What? Who? What's going on?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Before I could explain, I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from the living room. Footsteps, his footsteps. The man was coming closer. "Tyler, get Mia and Jordan up now," I whispered frantically. Tyler shot up from the bed, immediately shaking Jordan and Mia awake, pulling them up with wide, panicked eyes. "Get up! We need to go!" Mia looked at us, confused and groggy, but seeing the fear in our eyes, she didn't ask any questions. Jordan, too, seemed to understand the urgency as his eyes widened. We didn't even think. We bolted for the back door, not wasting a second. Tyler shoved the door open, and we rushed outside, barefoot, our feet slapping against the cold, damp grass. The backyard was dark, but there was no time to look around. We didn't care where we were going, only that we had to get out of the house. We ran to the neighbor's house, not stopping for a moment. I banged on the door as hard as I could, my breath coming out in frantic gasps. Mr. Davis, the elderly man who lived next door, answered the door, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. But when he saw the terror in our eyes, his expression quickly shifted to one of worry. "Are you kids all right?" he asked, stepping back to let us in. "There's someone in Tyler's house," I managed to say, my words tumbling out in a rush. "A man on the couch. He shouldn't be there. Please, you have to call the police." Without hesitation, Mr. Davis reached for the phone, dialing 911 immediately. We huddled together in his kitchen, trying to catch our breath, our eyes darting to the window that looked out toward Tyler's house. Every passing car made us jump, our hearts leaping into our throats, wondering if the man was out there, watching us. When the police finally arrived, we explained everything, but they didn't seem to understand. They searched the entire house, top to bottom, but found nothing. No man. No sign of anyone. The only thing out of place was the front door, unlocked and slightly ajar. It was like the man had vanished into thin air. The police told us it was probably some sort of prank or maybe someone who had gotten confused and wandered in. But we all knew the truth. Whoever that man was, he wasn't supposed to be there. And to this day, no one knows who he was, how he got in, or what he was waiting for. But every time I think back to that night, I can still picture him sitting on that couch, staring blankly at the TV, waiting for something. Someone. It was supposed to be a simple sleepover. The kind of night you look forward to when you're a kid. The nights where you just want to stay up late, laugh, and be with your friends without a care in the world. You know, the type of sleepover where you're not really expecting anything to happen, except maybe a few silly pranks or scary stories shared in the dark. I'm Alex, by the way, the one who thought it'd be a great idea to invite my two best friends, Jamie and Ryan, to my house for a sleepover in my backyard. I mean, what could possibly go wrong, right? I had always loved the idea of camping in my own yard. It felt like the perfect mix of adventure and comfort. Nothing too wild, but still enough to feel like we were getting away from everything, even if it was just for one night. We set everything up around 8 p.m., right as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. I remember how the sky looked, still glowing with the soft orange and pink of twilight, fading into dark blue. My parents weren't home that night, so the house was quiet, and it was just us three, left to do whatever we wanted. I have a pretty decent-sized backyard, surrounded by a high wooden fence and a few scattered trees. There's an old oak at the far end, and a couple of fruit trees that are starting to show signs of life after winter. It's a typical suburban California yard. Nothing fancy, but enough to make you feel like you're in a small, peaceful world of your own. We'd spent the evening roasting marshmallows over a small fire pit. The air was warm, but not too hot, with that familiar summer scent of grass and wood. It felt peaceful, calm, almost like a scene from some cheesy movie. We'd made s'mores, laughed at bad jokes, and told each other ghost stories. Nothing too intense, just the usual, "Did you hear that?" kind of scary stories that made us all jump a little, but nothing that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up for real. I had brought out an old lantern and set it up inside the tent. The glow from the lantern flickered gently, casting long shadows across the yard. The tent was small, just enough for the three of us to huddle inside, and it felt cozy. We sat on sleeping bags, making up stories, playing games, and scrolling through our phones between bursts of laughter. It wasn't until much later that things started to shift. Around midnight, when we had all started to grow tired, the atmosphere outside started to feel different. It was subtle at first, but I could feel it. I'm sure Ryan and Jamie could feel it too. Maybe it was because of the way the night seemed to become so still, like all the sounds of the world outside were dampened. The wind had died down, and the crickets' chirping had slowed to an almost unnatural quiet. Then came the motion sensor light. At first, I didn't think anything of it. We were sitting inside the tent, cracking jokes about something Ryan had done earlier. I remember it clearly. Ryan was trying to roast the perfect marshmallow, but he'd gotten distracted, and it caught fire. I laughed so hard at him, telling him he couldn't even make a marshmallow without turning it into charcoal. That's when we all heard it. The motion sensor light on the side of the house clicked on. It wasn't just a flicker, like when the wind pushes a branch in front of the sensor. It was a strong, sudden light that illuminated the entire side of the house. For a split second, everything went bright, like someone had turned on a floodlight. It was so intense that I had to squint, and then it clicked off just as quickly as it had come on. For a moment, all of us were quiet, and I could feel a shift in the air. "It's just the wind," Jamie said, though there was something off about her voice. It was too casual, too uncertain, but I wasn't so sure. I'd lived here my whole life, and I knew that light. The sensor on that side of the house usually took a bit of time to activate. It wasn't sensitive like the ones on the front porch that would flicker when a bird flew by. No, this one was different. It would turn on only when something moved with a certain amount of force. It was designed to detect people. Ryan, still chewing on his burnt marshmallow, shrugged. Probably just a cat or a raccoon or something. I wanted to believe that. Honestly, I did. I mean, we all had seen animals pass through the yard before, especially raccoons who loved to rummage through the trash cans at night. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the light. It was the stillness. The unnatural quiet. "Should we check it out?" Jamie asked, glancing nervously at the flap of the tent. I could tell she was already getting antsy. I didn't want to either, but I didn't want to admit that I was starting to feel uneasy too. Ryan shot a glance at the house. "Nah, it's fine. It's probably nothing. Let's just finish this game and go to sleep." But despite his words, none of us felt like sleeping. The air had become thick with unease. There was a tension in the yard now. I kept glancing out of the tent, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had set the light off. The shadows around the edges of the yard seemed to grow longer, stretching as if they were reaching toward us. I couldn't see anything through the mesh of the tent, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. A few minutes passed in silence, and just when I thought we might be able to brush it off, something happened. The light flickered back on again, but this time, it didn't go off immediately. It stayed on, shining bright against the side of the house. I could see it clearly now, the bright halo of light revealing the dark edges of the yard, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the corner of the house, just barely within the reach of the light, was a figure. I didn't know what to make of it at first. I thought it was a trick of the light, my mind playing games on me, or maybe one of the neighbors while walking by. But no. This figure didn't move. Not even an inch. It just stood there, perfectly still. Its body was dark, silhouetted by the light, making it hard to see any details. But there was no mistaking that it was a person. My heart skipped a beat. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I instinctively turned to look at Ryan and Jamie. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Ryan and Jamie froze, their eyes following mine. For a moment, we all just stared. I was holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. The figure didn't move, it didn't shift. It just stood there, facing the house, facing us. Every second felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But I couldn't. I just couldn't. Something in me knew this wasn't a neighbor or someone passing by. This was different. This was wrong. The figure didn't seem lost or confused. It wasn't looking for something. It wasn't even looking around. It was just standing there, watching. My mouth went dry. I didn't know what to do. Should I scream? But before I could even think, the figure moved. It didn't run, but it took a slow, deliberate step forward. The light caught something on its side, a faint glint of metal. My stomach twisted into knots. The glint, was it a knife? I couldn't breathe. And then it moved again. Another step, closer and closer. "Get inside," Ryan hissed, his voice panicked. His eyes were wide with fear, and his grip tightened on the zipper of the tent, ready to make a break for it. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, but at the same time, I felt an overwhelming need to run. Something inside me screamed that we needed to get out of there, now. The figure stepped forward again. Then it stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, almost like a metal scraping. Ryan's voice broke the silence. We need to go. Now. And just like that, all of us scrambled, fumbling to open the tent. We didn't think. We didn't even look back. We just ran. We bolted. There wasn't even a second to think. It was pure instinct, our bodies moving faster than our minds could process. I remember how my legs felt like they were moving on autopilot, pushing me toward the door of the house. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat a heavy thud that echoed in my ears. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the figure out there, getting closer, the sound of its steps faint but relentless. Jamie was right behind me, her breath ragged, her feet stumbling over the uneven grass. Ryan was the first to reach the door, slamming his palm against the sliding glass door. It didn't open at first. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him a few tries to get the latch open. I could hear the metal scraping against the door frame, and the panic in his movements only made everything feel worse. "Come on!" Ryan shouted, voice tight with fear. I was right there with him, grabbing the handle and pulling with all my strength, finally forcing the door open. We rushed inside, the coolness of the house a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the night. But even as we stumbled into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe yet. "Lock it! Lock it!" Jamie gasped, her voice frantic. I didn't even think, just slid the deadbolt into place as fast as I could. My hands were still trembling. I could hear Jamie frantically dialing 911, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was no mistaking the fear in it. She was already talking to the dispatcher, explaining that someone was outside our house, near the backyard, and had a knife. I could hear her voice cracking as she spoke, but she was doing her best to remain calm. I couldn't focus on her words. I had to look outside. I ran to the window near the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest like it might explode. My eyes searched the backyard through the glass, straining to see anything. The yard, usually peaceful and familiar, now felt like an entirely different place. The darkness swallowed up everything beyond the pool of light from the back porch. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, clinging to the edges of the house, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was just beyond my line of sight, waiting. I didn't know how long I stood there, peering into the night. Every second felt like an eternity. The more I stared into the yard, the more I convinced myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the shadows. Maybe it was nothing after all. But then I saw it. Movement. It was subtle at first, just a small shift near the side of the house. I couldn't make out any details, but there was no mistaking it. I stepped back from the window, my stomach flipping in fear. My breath felt shallow, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to see any more. I didn't want to know. "Is it him?" Ryan asked from behind me, his voice shaking. I turned toward him, my mind racing. "I think so. I saw something move outside." We all huddled together in the living room, the only sound now being the frantic hum of Jamie's voice on the phone with the 911 dispatcher. I don't know why I felt like I needed to keep checking the windows, but I couldn't help it. It was like my mind wouldn't let me stop looking, even though I knew it would only make everything worse. "Where's the flashlight?" I heard Jamie say suddenly. I turned around, confused. "What do you mean?" "There's a flashlight in the kitchen drawer," she said, eyes wide, voice urgent. "I want to see if I can spot him. He might be close." Ryan shook his head. "No, don't. We need to stay away from the windows. We don't know if he's still out there." But Jamie was already moving toward the kitchen, her hand reaching for the drawer. She wasn't scared anymore, at least not in the way we were. She was determined, almost as if she felt like taking action would give her control over the situation. "Jamie, no," I whispered, my voice hoarse, but it was too late. She clicked on the flashlight and aimed it through the window. The beam cut through the darkness, sharp and focused. For a second, I thought maybe she'd made a mistake. Maybe she would shine it on a tree branch or something harmless, and we'd be able to laugh about it later. But then, there it was. The figure. It was a person. Definitely a person. But the details were impossible to make out. Too dark, too shadowed. The only thing I could make out for sure was that they were watching us. There was a strange calmness about it. It wasn't a frantic rush to the house. It wasn't a person trying to get in quickly. It was just a slow, deliberate waiting, the kind of stillness that sends ice through your veins. Ryan and Jamie gasped at the same time. We all stepped back from the window, we went instinctively moving away from the light, like that would somehow make us less visible. We huddled together, crouching near the couch, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. "What the hell do we do?" Ryan whispered, voice shaking. I didn't know what to say. We were trapped inside. I couldn't see the figure clearly anymore, but I knew it was there. I could feel it, and it was getting closer. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, each one feeling like an eternity. I tried to focus on something, anything, but my mind kept racing, and the only thing I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then we heard something. A knock at the back door. It was faint, but we all heard it. My eyes locked onto Jamie's. She was holding her breath, and I could see the terror in her eyes. She didn't need to say it out loud, but we all knew what it meant. The figure was no longer just outside. It was testing the door. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was no way to explain it. The sensation of being hunted, of knowing that the person outside was trying to get in, and they were getting closer. "We need to call 911 again," Jamie said in a whisper. But she had already called once, and they hadn't arrived yet. I didn't know how long it would take. "We just have to wait," Ryan said, his voice sounding almost strangled now. "We just need to wait for the police." The knocking stopped. Silence fell over us like a heavy blanket. But the silence was worse than any noise. It was the kind of quiet that suffocated you, that made you feel like you were holding your breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. But the unease still clung to the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still waiting for the right moment, and that moment felt like it was coming fast. The air in the house was thick with tension, every breath feeling heavier than the last. We were all silent now, our eyes glued to the windows, waiting for anything to happen. I could feel the weight of my heart, heavy and unsteady in my chest. Each passing second felt like a lifetime, and with every minute that ticked by, the fear grew, an unshakable dread that seemed to creep into my bones. The knocking at the back door had stopped, but that didn't mean the figure was gone. No, I knew that wasn't the case. It was still out there somewhere, moving in the shadows, testing the boundaries of our safety. The thought of it made my stomach churn. What did it want? Why was it just watching us? And what the hell was it planning to do next? "I'm calling 911 again," Jamie said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. She grabbed her phone, but before she could even dial, we heard it. The sirens, the wail of police cars in the distance, the sound we'd all been hoping for, but also dreading. I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time all night, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the fear that whatever was out there was about to make its move before the police arrived. Then we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating. I don't know if I breathed a sigh of relief or held my breath in fear. The figure was gone, but it didn't feel over. Not yet. Minutes later, the police arrived. 2 squad cars, their lights flashing in the driveway. I ran outside to meet them, my body still shaking, adrenaline surging. They immediately started checking the yard, searching the corners of the fence, and calling out for anyone who might be hiding. But despite their thorough search, the figure was gone. The officers told us to stay inside, to lock up the house, and they would increase patrols in the area. They seemed just as confused as we were, but they assured us that they would keep an eye on the place. But the truth was, they never found him, never caught the intruder. No one ever came forward to explain what had happened that night. The figure with the knife, whoever or whatever it was, simply disappeared. We never went back to sleep that night. The fear lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I don't know if I'll ever truly feel safe again, not in my own home. It's a weird feeling moving into a new house. You think you're prepared, right? But nothing really prepares you for the quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into your bones and creeps into the corners of your mind. That's exactly how I felt when I moved into this house in a quiet suburb of California. The house is fine, not huge, but not tiny either. It's got enough space for my parents and me. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room, and a backyard. It's the kind of house people buy when they want to start over, like my parents did. Honestly, I wasn't thrilled about the move. I mean, I get it. It's a fresh start. My mom was excited. My dad was too, but he was more about the whole this is a good investment thing. They were already talking about how we decorate it and what we do once we were settled. But me, I wasn't feeling it. I had to leave my friends, my school, the only place I had ever really known. It felt like everything that made my life mine was now in a box, packed away somewhere in the middle of the living room. When we first got here, the house felt empty. I know it sounds stupid, but when you step into a place that's not really yours yet, it feels like it's still waiting for someone to fill it. I spent the first few days just wandering around, unpacking random things. There were boxes everywhere. Some were opened, some were still taped shut, and the walls were bare, as if the house hadn't figured out what it wanted to be yet. Everything in the house seemed a little too quiet, like it was just waiting for something to happen, something to give it life. And yeah, there were all those little noises. The way the floor creaked when I walked through the hall, the random thud from somewhere in the house that could have been a door settling or the wind. The sound of the fridge kicking on and off, filling the silence with its low hum. I was trying to convince myself that it was all just normal, but it didn't feel normal. It felt off. You know that feeling when something isn't right, but you can't figure out exactly what it is? That was me, standing in the middle of a new house, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Anyway, that Friday, my parents went out of town for the weekend. It was just going to be me alone, which, to be honest, kind of freaked me out. Not because I'm afraid of being alone, but because the house still didn't feel like home. So I did what anyone would do. I invited my best friend Matthew over for a sleepover. Matthew and I had been friends since elementary school. We did all the usual things: play video games, watch movies, prank each other, and eat way too much junk food. It was pretty much the best way to take my mind off how unsettling everything felt. Matthew showed up around 6:30 p.m., and by then the sun was starting to set, painting everything in that dusky orange glow. The kind of glow where shadows stretch across the walls and everything feels a little more dramatic. We grabbed some pizza, set up the couch for a movie marathon, and cracked open a couple cans of soda. The air felt cool, but it wasn't cold enough to make us want to bundle up in blankets. Still, there was something about that evening that felt quieter than usual. Not in a peaceful way, either. It was the kind of quiet where you keep turning around, expecting someone to be standing behind you, even though you know no one is. The house was still half packed, with boxes in the corners of the rooms, but it was becoming more comfortable. But still, there was this space. Something that didn't belong, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe it was just the fact that everything was new. It's like stepping into someone else's house, and no matter how nice it is, it never really feels like yours right away. I guess that's what made me feel uneasy. Everything was just too unfamiliar. Even the way the floorboards groaned as we walked through the rooms made me feel like I was trespassing in my own home. Matthew and I tried to push it aside. We popped in one of those old horror movies we loved, the kind with terrible special effects and predictable jump scares. We joked about the terrible acting and cringed at the scenes that were so bad they were good. It was a fun distraction. At least until we heard it. A knock. It wasn't anything that stood out at first, but there was something about it. The rhythm was just too quick, too loud. It echoed through the quiet house, cutting into the sound of the TV. It made my heart skip for a second, and I looked over at Matthew, who was already staring back at me. We both hesitated. Neither of us moved. We just stared at the door. The knock came again, this time with a bit more urgency. "Who could that be?" Matthew asked, almost whispering. I shrugged, feeling that old unease creep back up. "I don't know," I muttered, getting up from the couch. My footsteps seemed too loud as I walked to the door, and for some reason I felt like I was walking through fog, slow and heavy. I peeked through the peephole. I still remember the man's face. His features weren't clear at first, but as I focused, I could see him more clearly. He was older than I expected. Mid-30s, maybe? He was wearing a dark hoodie that was way too big for him, his hands shoved in the pockets, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he didn't know what to do with himself. The look on his face was hard to explain. He looked like he was trying to seem friendly, but it was forced, awkward, like he wasn't used to talking to people. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Hey, hello? I'm your neighbor," he called out, his voice carrying through the door. It sounded like he was trying to be casual, but there was a strange edge to it. "I've got a bad leak in my house, and I don't know what to do about it. Can you help me shut off my water?" I frowned, pulling back from the peephole to look at Matthew, who was now standing behind me. "I don't recognize him," I said quietly. "I haven't seen anyone moving into that house next door." Matthew nodded, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, I don't either. You should just tell him no." I wasn't sure if it was the way he spoke or the fact that the house next door had been empty for days now, but something about the situation didn't sit right. It felt off. Maybe it was just me being paranoid, but I didn't want to take any chances. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," I called out through the door, trying to keep my voice firm. I didn't want to sound like I was nervous, but the words felt too soft, too unsure. There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought maybe he'd leave. But then he spoke again, and his voice was different this time. It was more insistent, more urgent. "Look, I really need help. The leak's bad, and I don't know what to do. You have to have a wrench or something. Just a quick favor," he said, sounding like he was growing impatient. I didn't know why, but I felt my heartbeat speed up. Something was wrong. I said no, I repeated, my voice a little sharper this time. Then came the sound that made my stomach drop. He slammed his fist against the door. Bang! It wasn't a knock, it was a punch. A violent, angry sound that made the door shake in its frame. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and I could hear Matthew's sharp intake of breath behind me. "Lock all the doors, dude," Matthew whispered, his voice tight with fear. I didn't need to be told twice. Panic hit me like a wave. My body moved on instinct as I rushed to the kitchen, my mind racing. I had to check the sliding door, but just as I reached for the handle, crash! It wasn't a knock. This time it was the sound of glass shattering. That was when everything changed. The sound of the glass breaking echoed through the house, louder than any of the creaks or rustles from earlier. I froze. My hand was still on the sliding door handle, but now my fingers felt like they were glued to it. My breath caught in my throat, and I could hear Matthew's footsteps as he rushed to my side, panic clear in his eyes. "Dude, what the hell was that?" Matthew whispered urgently, his voice low but trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too busy trying to process what had just happened. That sound, shattering glass, it was coming from the front of the house, the front window. I hadn't even heard anything before it. It was like the man outside had just smashed it without warning. Matthew grabbed my arm and yanked me away from the sliding door. We need to go, he said, his voice rising in panic. Now. I didn't need any more convincing. We ran through the kitchen, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that I thought it might burst. I was half expecting to hear the sound of footsteps behind us, someone chasing us through the house. But there was nothing, just that silence, like everything was holding its breath. I turned back to check the front door, but there was no sign of the man. I had no idea where he'd gone. Maybe he was already inside. My mind raced, thinking of all the places he could be. The kitchen was still empty. The living room, empty. I glanced over at Matthew. He was shaking, wide-eyed, clearly as freaked out as I was. Dude, we need to lock every door, every window, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. There was no time to argue. We had to get out, but we had to make sure we were safe first. I glanced back toward the hallway, the faint glow from the TV flickering in the living room, casting long shadows on the walls. The hallway was pitch black, except for the light from the back door. It felt like something was waiting there, something that didn't belong. Without a word, Matthew and I ran to the front of the house, checking every window as we went, pulling down the blinds, locking the doors. I tried to stay calm, but its hands were shaking as I slid the bolt into place on the back door, the metal clanging loudly in the quiet. Suddenly, there was a noise from upstairs, something scraping across the floor. I froze. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was moving around up there. It was the unmistakable sound of someone walking. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't some pipe creaking. No. Someone was in the house. Matthew's eyes widened, and he motioned toward the kitchen. We need to get out of here. I knew what he meant. We had to go through the backyard, hop the fence, and get into the neighbor's yard. But the thought of running out into the dark, not knowing where the men were or if they were already inside, sent chills down my spine. But what choice did we have? Just as we were about to turn toward the backyard door, I heard it. Footsteps. These weren't slow like before. These were fast, heavy, purposeful. They were coming down the stairs. Matthew grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the back. Now, Jake, now! We rushed for the door. I didn't even care about being quiet anymore. I just wanted to get out of the house. My heart was hammering in my chest as I threw the door open. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap to the face. I barely noticed the gravel under my bare feet as I sprinted for the fence. The night was black. The only sounds were the crunch of my feet on the gravel and the frantic breathing from Matthew and me. I could hear the doors inside creak open. Footsteps, now unmistakably heavier. They were coming. Matthew pushed me ahead, making sure I was in front of him as we neared the fence. The world around me felt like it was closing in. My mind was spinning with 1,000 thoughts, but the only thing I could focus on was the fence, the only way out. We didn't hesitate. We climbed the fence quickly, even though my feet stung from the rough edges. It didn't matter. I didn't feel the pain. I didn't feel anything except fear as I scrambled over the top. I hit the ground hard, my legs buckling beneath me. But I didn't stop. Matthew followed, landing beside me with a soft grunt. We sprinted across the neighbor's yard, the grass wet and cold under our feet. The night felt heavy with tension. Every shadow seemed like it was hiding someone. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps. But we didn't stop. We just ran. The house next door, our neighbor's house, was dark, quiet. It was an eerie kind of dark, the kind of dark that makes you feel like you're not supposed to be there. But we didn't have time to worry about that. We ducked behind a shed in the back corner of the yard, pressing ourselves against the cold wood. We could barely see the other side of the yard, but I didn't want to risk moving. Every sound, every rustle, made my heart jump into my throat. Matthew fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. He dialed 911 quickly, his voice almost cracking when he was explaining the situation. The minutes felt like hours. Every time I moved, I thought I'd see the flash of a flashlight cutting through the darkness, or hear the crack of a twig beneath someone's boot. The silence pressed in on me from all sides, and I could hear Matthew's breath next to me, ragged and quick, matching mine. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A voice, muffled but clear. "We need to find them," a man said, his voice low but demanding. The words sent a shock of fear through me. I instinctively held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the shadow of the shed. The men were in the neighbor's yard. They were so close. My body tensed, and I could feel my heart beating against my ribs. I was afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. "They've got to be here," the second voice said. "Check the yard." I could hear footsteps again, slow, deliberate, as if they were searching every corner. They were coming closer. The men were walking in our direction, not far from where we were hiding. I glanced over at Matthew, his face pale in the dim light. He looked just as terrified as I felt, maybe more. I had no idea how long we could stay hidden. The men were getting closer, and we had nowhere to run. Just as I thought we were going to be caught, I heard something else, something that cut through the silence like a blade. The sound of sirens, the unmistakable wail of police cars. For a moment I thought I imagined it, but then the sound grew louder, sharper. It was real. The men froze. I heard them curse under their breath. Then suddenly I heard the sound of retreating footsteps. They were running. The sirens grew louder as they disappeared into the distance, but we didn't move. We stayed crouched, holding our breath, until the sounds of the police cars were right on top of us. When they finally arrived, everything felt like it shifted. The sirens wailed closer, louder, until I could hear the squeal of tires as police cars screeched to a halt just beyond the fence. It was almost too much to take in, too much to process. I was shaking. My whole body felt like it had been frozen in place, like I couldn't even move if I wanted to. I could hear the officers shouting to each other, their voices sharp and urgent. "Get to the back! They can't be far!" I couldn't see them yet, but I could hear their boots hitting the gravel, crunching it beneath their weight as they ran toward the house. The darkness of the backyard felt thick and suffocating, like it was swallowing everything around me. My eyes were glued to the space between the shed and the fence, praying that we weren't spotted. Matthew and I didn't make a sound. We just huddled together, every muscle tense, waiting for whatever would come next. Seconds passed, then minutes. I couldn't tell how long we sat there, not moving. Time seemed to stretch, to twist, until it was impossible to tell how much had really passed. I could hear the officers shouting, their voices bouncing off the walls of the houses, each call growing more frantic as they searched. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a voice from the far side of the yard, one of the officers calling out, "Clear!" The tension that had been building inside me snapped. I felt the rush of relief flood through me, followed by exhaustion. My legs were shaking, my entire body drained, but I stayed still, afraid to even breathe too loudly in case someone was still out there, listening. Matthew's breath was quick beside me. He wasn't saying anything, but I could tell he was trying to process everything. His hands were clenching and unclenching at his sides, like he was unsure whether to say something or just keep quiet. A few more moments passed, and then the officers were suddenly all around us, their flashlights cutting through the dark, harsh, and bright. I had to blink a few times, adjusting to the sudden flood of light. "Are you two okay?" one of the officers asked. His face was stern, but his voice was surprisingly gentle. I nodded, still too shaken to speak, but Matthew answered, his voice hoarse. "We're okay. We just ran." The officer nodded and stood, signaling for a couple of other officers to approach. "It's a good thing you did. These guys are dangerous. We've been tracking them for weeks now." Matthew and I both looked at each other, our faces pale. Neither of us could process what we were hearing. Weeks? How had this happened? What were they doing here? One of the officers began asking us questions, trying to piece together exactly what happened. He mentioned how the men had been suspected of breaking into multiple homes, targeting places that looked newly vacant or under renovation. He said the men were wanted for several violent break-ins across the area, and the police had been trying to catch them for a while. The man who had knocked on our door wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't even from the area. He was a home invader with a long history of violent crime. I felt my stomach churn as I listened. The reality of what had happened only began to settle in. The man who had come to our door, who had knocked, who had shouted, who had broken the glass, he was part of a crew that had been casing homes, looking for people to target. And if Matthew and I hadn't acted as fast as we did, there's no telling what might have happened. One of the officers turned to the others, his voice lowering. We'll need to go through the house, make sure it's all clear. Can we come with you?" I asked, my voice shaking now. I had to know. I had to see what had happened inside the house. What if they had gone through all of our things? What if they'd been looking for something? The officer gave me a somber nod. "Stay close. We're going to make sure everything's secured." As we walked back toward the house, the full weight of the situation hit me. The house that had felt so unfamiliar, so eerie, now felt like a stranger's home. The broken glass was scattered across the front yard, glittering under the harsh light of the police flashlights. There were no signs of the men. They had disappeared into the night, but the damage they left behind was all too real. The officers moved carefully through the house, checking every room, every corner. The house felt even emptier now than it did before. The silence was unnerving. It felt like it was hollowed out, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. Matthew and I stood in the living room, barely daring to move. I could hear the officers talking in low voices. "Nothing in here," one of them said, and then, "It's clear." They moved into the next room, and Matthew turned to me. "What if they had already been inside?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't want to think about it. The idea of those men in our house going through our stuff, it made me feel sick. But the worst part was, I had no way of knowing how long they had been watching us. When the officers finally finished their search, they turned to us with the same somber expressions. "We've secured the perimeter," one of the officers said. "The men are gone, but we're going to need to take statements from both of you. If you remember anything else, anything at all, no matter how small, tell us. It could help." We both nodded, too shaken to say anything more. The police wrapped up their investigation and began to leave, their cars pulling away into the night. The eerie quiet returned, but it wasn't the same. The house was different now. I could feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on it. I wasn't sure I'd ever look at this place the same way again. After the last car pulled away, Matthew and I stood in the living room for a long time, neither of us speaking. Finally, Matthew broke the silence. "Dude," he said, his voice hoarse, "that was way too close." I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. I was still too shaken to form words. But he was right. It had been way too close. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Yeah, way too close." That night, we didn't get any sleep. Neither of us could. It felt like the house was still holding its breath, yet still waiting for something. The terror from earlier, the panic, it clung to every corner. Even though the danger was gone, the fear lingered.